Hey everyone, welcome back to Jesse's Hangout. Welcome. I'm your host, Jesse, aka Jesse Gamers. Welcome. Today's episode is going to be a part one of a 4-part special edition series. Today's episode is episode number 7. This is a review and kind of a talk about The Last of Us. I hope you guys enjoyed the thumbnail. I wanted to make the thumbnail different for the special edition ones, so I hope you guys will enjoy those. The second episode, or the second part to this, will be me reminiscing about games that I previously played, and also a little bit more of my intake on online gaming, the kind of the pros and the cons and the dangers of it. I'm going to kind of go a little bit more in depth with it. I think I tried to record it. I don't know if I actually mentioned anything on a series about it, but I'm going to talk a little bit about it. Kind of give you a little bit of insight on what I've personally have actually experienced with online gaming, and also I want to also do an episode where I do a review on another game that I recently started playing. I'm going to do a review on 2 of them actually, because they're 2 newer games. I'm going to kind of do it a little bit different than normal, so that will be in the 3rd episode, and then the last episode will be a special one, but we'll see what happens with that one. I'm still trying to figure that last one out, because I want the last one to be really good, so without further ado, let's get into today's episode. If you have not seen or played or watched the gameplays on YouTube of The Last of Us Part 1, The Last of Us Part 2, and The Last of Us 2, please go watch those or play those games, get your perspective on it, and then come back to this episode. So without further ado, let's get into it, because there are some spoilers in this episode. I'm just wanting to state that. So anyways, basically the first one dropped in 2013 by Naughty Dog. Naughty Dog is also responsible for a really popular game called Crash, and another really popular series called Uncharted. They were responsible for that game too. They're a really good corporation. They've done a lot of animated games before, but they're responsible for these 2 huge realistic games. I'm hoping in the future that they do more type of realistic games. I think it would be really cool to see what other ones they come up with in the future. But yeah, they're responsible for those games. They're really good. They're really good games. I've never really played them personally, but I've watched them personally, and just by the looks and the way that some of them have said that it plays pretty cool from what I'm seeing. The Last of Us Part 2 starts off with Joel and his daughter Sarah. It's his birthday night. Joel is an construction worker. He was born in Texas. He did have a wife, but he really doesn't talk much about her. I'm assuming she might have passed away, because she's really not in the picture with the both of them. So it could be possible that she either passed away from something, or she's just not in the picture, period. So it's just him and Sarah. They live in a house. And then she ends up giving him a watch, and they kind of just kid around with each other. They seem to have a really good relationship with each other. Joel is at the beginning. Joel is kind of seen as this really average, normal person that has a lot of issues, but he's working through them. He has his daughter with him. He gets through it day by day. And Joel can also be kind of a hothead and stubborn at times. So he just kind of comes off that way at first. And one night, his daughter Sarah ends up waking up in the middle of the night, which I think is probably like midnight or so, looking for her dad. She couldn't figure out where Jewel went. And then all of a sudden, Jewel comes flying in the sliding glass door, freaking out because the neighbors kind of turned psycho. Apparently, they were victims to the virus outbreak that causes. It's kind of like a fungal virus. It turns people into clickers, and it goes through several different stages. It's a really, really scary virus, so to speak. I'm not going to name it because I'm going to let you figure that out when you watch it. So that's one spoiler I won't give. I'm just going to call it an unknown one. So it ends up breaking out, and in the midst of it breaking out and all the chaos, Jewel has a brother. His name is Tommy. He comes to the rescue trying to get both of them out there, trying to evacuate. It's a bit of a chaos of a ride, and then all of a sudden they end up splitting up on foot, and he ends up carrying his daughter because his daughter doesn't really have any shoes on, but he just kind of ends up carrying her. And Jewel ends up coming up to a checkpoint with a bunch of military. Well, this checkpoint was given orders to shoot to kill, basically. Jewel ended up getting to it, and they ended up shooting at Jewel and his daughter ended up getting shot. And it was basically Jewel and his daughter were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they reacted to them both, and he ended up losing his daughter. His daughter died in his arms. And it was a really horrific event. It was horrifying. It affected Jewel mentally and physically. It just kind of made him into the person he is 20 years later, which fast forward to 20 years, summertime in the 2000s. It was like 2023 or something like that. Which is really interesting to say the least. But it flash forward to it 20 years later. He's a smuggler. He has a smuggling partner named Tess. She is a smuggler herself. They're both kind of just these rebels who kind of smuggle weapons. They smuggle pretty much anything they could really get their hands on. That's kind of what smugglers do. They pretty much just smuggle anything that they can make money off of. And that's kind of what they do, and that's kind of what Joel and Tess do. But Tess and Joel kind of end up in a pickle where they were supposed to get weapons from a guy they were supposed to get these weapons and sell these weapons, but it ended up being betrayed by a friend of theirs, Robert, and he ends up selling them to the Fireflies, and he ends up finally telling Jewel and Tess about it, and Tess ends up getting really peeved and being the hot-headed and doing what she did. She ended up killing Robert for it. And then they end up getting into this huge standoff with Robert's goons, Robert's minions. And they end up bumping into Ellie and a wounded Firefly leader. They end up bumping into the both of them, and this Firefly leader proceeds to tell them why she and Ellie are here, and proceeds to tell them that Ellie was bit but was unimmune to the virus. It didn't affect her. She bonded with it, and because of that, there might be a real high possibility that they could make a cure from Ellie. And they need to get her to the facility to find out where the infection is at and see what they can do to extract it to make the cure. And Ellie's kind of one in a million, so to speak. She's one out of, very rarely does that happen. Pretty much Ellie's the only one that has the cure, basically. and you'll see what I mean when I get into further into this story. Um, Tess and Jewel end up agreeing to take Ellie across the infected United States, the basically apocalyptic United States. Basically, Mother Nature's basically taking the Earth. It's pretty much just a bunch of ruined buildings, abandoned cars, abandoned buildings, just all sorts of stuff. So they have to take her through this dangerous infected United States that go through certain places into certain states. And as they're going to it, they end up getting into this standoff with these checkpoint military officers, and Tess ends up revealing that she got bit by one of the clickers and ends up being infected, and she ends up sacrificing herself for Jewel and Ellie to get out of there, and Tess ends up dying. And it was a really, really hard moment in that game. It was really, really sad moment in that game. I think I actually really teared up in that part. So Jewel and Ellie end up escaping the building, although they kind of have to fight their way out of it, but they end up finally getting out of it. Jewel ends up getting emotionally attached to Ellie, which now that Jewel is 20 years older and is 20 years later, Joel's personality has changed. After losing his daughter, it changed him. After watching the horrific events of the outbreak, it changed him. It changed him mentally and physically, and it causes him to make decisions and do things that he shouldn't have done, and cause him to have a lot of enemies, and it caused Jewel to be kind of emotionally, I wouldn't necessarily say emotionally unstable, but he gets emotionally attached to things pretty quick, and I think that's one of his weaknesses, is he gets emotionally attached to a lot of things, especially when it reminds him of his daughter Sarah, and Ellie kind of reminds him of her, because she was just as stubborn as Ellie is, and he kind of takes her under his wing, and they kind of bond. And that bond gets really strong. And Joel's in this time, now that it's 20 years later, Joel's a sensitive person, a very sensitive, very emotional, very hot-headed, and very full of anger type person because of everything that he went through. And so like I said, he gets emotionally attached to Ellie, and they get to the facility, and as he starts talking to this Firefly, and this Firefly tells him that she's the only one that's unimmune to the virus. And she explains to him that in order for them to extract a cure from Ellie, they have to kill Ellie in order to get the cure from her. It's located in her brain, apparently. And Joel goes into this freak out thing of losing his marbles. He ends up breaking into the operation room, ends up killing all of the doctors and nurses in there, ends up saving Ellie, and flies out of there. Well, as Joel is driving, he kind of gives a edited version of the events that happened. He pretty much lies to Ellie. He basically tells Ellie that there's other people out there who are immune, and that they can find the cure from somebody else, and that she deserves to live, and they were wrong about it, that it wasn't going to work, and all that type of stuff. But the truth is Ellie would have been able to save people. She would have been able to save it. Whether it would have worked or not, Ellie would have died trying to save people. And that's what that's what sets off The Last of Us Part 2. But before I go into The Last of Us Part 2, Naughty Dog creates The Last of or before I go into Last of Us 2, sorry. Last of Us creates a second part to the first part of the video game, but this goes centered around a little bit of background of Ellie and how she got infected. Basically what happened is her and her friend were her friend is part of the Fireflies. So she and Ellie end up sneaking out of where Ellie's at. They end up going to the mall. And, being kids, they just kind of end up playing around in there, and then all of a sudden they get into this standoff fight with these clickers, and they end up both getting bit by it. So they end up just kind of sitting there at this fountain waiting to just lose their mind and eventually die from it. But sadly, only her friend only dies from it, but Ellie doesn't. Ellie becomes unimmune to it. And she ends up bonding with it, so to speak. And she ends up bumping into the leader of the Fireflies and ends up being taken under her wing and ends up going to the facility to find out whether or not there is a way of a cure. And there was 100% chance that she could save people. And Ellie gets really mad, and that's what really sets off Last of Us 2. Last of Us 2, it flash forwards to 4 years later. It's been 4 years since the incident. It's been 4 years since Joel kind of lost his marbles, and it's been 4 years since Tess' death. And he's living in a village that Tommy created with his wife and a couple of others. And it kind of sets him apart where Ellie's kind of angry at him right now because there was a little dance that went on, and Joel kind of punched a dude, and he kind of got into a kerfuffle. It was over a friend of Ellie's who she becomes friends with. Ellie kind of creates a little life for herself as well. She lives separate from Joel. She kind of lives on her own, so to speak. And she's friends with Jessie, she's friends with Diana. But Diana kind of floats both ways. And this is what sparked another controversy with Naughty Dogs. It's always been a political controversy when it comes to sexual orientation and anything in the games with sexual orientation or sexual encounters in games and all that. It's always been a controversy in any games. That's why you rarely see it. But this happened to be one of the games that Naughty Dog shows it. And I think it was like the first time they've ever showed something like that. I don't know if they showed it in Uncharted or not. I can't really remember off the top of my head if they have. But I think this is the first one they've actually really showed it. And it sparked a really big controversy, especially with finding out Ellie's sexual orientation. She likes girls, but I think she also likes guys too, but she likes girls. She's kind of in a phase of trying to figure herself out. And she gets close to Diana at this party, and Diana ends up kissing her. And then this guy that's at the bar that's friends of Tommy and his wife, and he's kind of a bit of a hothead, he's kind of just dead set in his ways, and, that's totally fine. But he ends up saying some stuff that he shouldn't say to Ellie, and Joel overhears it, and he gets involved, and a whole kerfuffle happens. And then, of course, Ellie gets mad at him for it. And, of course, when a teenager or a young adult gets mad at their guardian or parent or whoever, they kind of don't talk to each other for a while. So Ellie kind of wakes up the next morning and is going out scouting because she's going out to check and see what's going on with things, and kind of going to relieve Joel and Tommy are just going to check on him, so to speak. So Diana ends up going with her. So they end up going and checking things out with Jessie and all that. In the meantime, it goes and centers around where Jules up in the mountains where it's really cold and dreary, and you know, it kind of shows him kind of scouting and walking around, and he ends up bumping into Abby, this other main character in the series. He ends up bumping into Abby. He ends up bumping into Abby, but he doesn't realize that Abby was the daughter of one of the doctors that he killed. One of the doctors was her father, the doctor that was supposed to operate on Ellie and get a cure from Ellie. But because of his rampage and him freaking out and doing what he did hot-headedly and not thinking before he did stuff, he ended up taking somebody's father from them. And it happened to have been Abby. And Abby was tracking Jewel down 4 years later. She's a grown adult now. She's probably a little bit older than Ellie is. But she looks roughly around the same age in a way. You could kind of tell the difference. I mean, she was a really big, buff lady. She's got a lot of muscles on her. She's, really trained a lot. She's done a lot in her life. And she's kind of, with the pack group of her friends, they're helping her track down Jewel. Apparently, she finally figures out that Jewel kind of has a habit of doing things and making decisions that he shouldn't be making, bad decisions he shouldn't be making, so to speak. And he's done a lot of things he shouldn't have done. And killing her father was one of them. And she ends up luring him into a trap. And then Ellie and Diana and I think Jessie ends up getting, and then Tommy ends up getting captured by these groups, and Ellie gets kind of beaten up a little bit. She ends up seeing Jewel die in front of her, and it affected Ellie because a little bit before or a little bit after the party that night, they didn't show this, but they show a little clip of what happened between Jewel and Ellie. Ellie ends up finding out the truth, and Ellie ends up getting really mad at him for it, and it causes a friction in their relationship. Ellie may be angry at him for making the decision that he made, and she couldn't forgive him for it. And she kind of holds on to this anger throughout the game. She really holds on to it, but she also holds on to the fact that she wants to find Abby and seek her revenge for what she did to him. But Ellie doesn't really quite fully understand exactly what Joel did. But despite what he did, despite the choices that he made, Ellie knows that Joel's a good man. He's a good person despite him not being necessarily the best person, but, he still has a lot of good in him. Ellie's really not the best person in the whole world either. She's not perfect either. But she's no hero either. She has her demons just like Joel does. And she pretty much gets affected by all of this. She gets emotionally and physically affected by what happened to Joel. And as she sets out after it, her friend Diana comes with her. Well, they end up hitting a speed bump, and Diana ends up telling her that she's pregnant with Jessie's child. And that kind of throws a wrench in Ellie's plan of going after Abby. And then Jessie ends up showing up and ends up taking care of Diana, and Ellie ends up going and searching for Abby. Because one way or another, Ellie's going to get this person for doing what she did to Joel, regardless of what it was. and her logic and reason just kind of flew out the window with it too. She ends up finding Abby eventually after killing her best friend, or after killing two of her best friends, I think. And she ends up in a standoff with Ellie, but Abby ends up winning the fight and beating the crap out of Ellie pretty well. And, they go their separate ways after that. Abby lets them both go. It still didn't set well with Ellie, and it flashed forward to about 6 months or a couple of months after what happened. It shows Ellie with Diana living in a farmhouse with her son. They've kind of created a life for each other, and Ellie tries to find a way to live a life without Joel and try to live with the horrific events that she went through. And it becomes very hard for Abby. Abby has PTSD and ends up with really bad depression and anxiety over things. So littlest noises could freak her out and cause her to have one, and she ends up kind of having one in a barn with the baby, and Diana ends up coming to look for her and kind of calms her down. And then they end up going back to the house, and then all of a sudden, Tommy shows up and tells Ellie that he found her. He knows where Abby is, and he's going after her, even despite being wounded himself through whatever he went through. Abby tells him that he shouldn't go after her, that he's wounded, and he asks her if she will do it, because he's not capable of practically doing it after she talks him out of it. She says no at first. At first, she doesn't want to do it. And then at night, she kind of sits there and tosses and turns at night. And then she ends up getting ready to go after her. She ends up going and doing it. And she gets into a kerfuffle with Diana that pretty much forever sets a really bad friction in their relationship. And Ellie ends up breaking off with Diana and ends up going after Abby, only to find Abby captured by some people she betrayed for saving this kid and his sister. And one of them survives, but his sister doesn't. And she ends up cutting Abby down. They end up getting into a fight in the water, but even at the end and after everything that happened, Ellie still couldn't do it. Ellie just really couldn't do it. And she lets Abby go, and they go their separate ways. They never see each other. They never speak about each other. They go their separate ways. And, Ellie is a good person, but she's also not a good person in a way, too. She also has her demons, like I said, in her closet, like Joel did. And she basically became a person that Joel didn't want her to become, but she became it anyway. And logic and reason kind of went out the window, and she sets off back to go home, but she kind of gets into kerfuffles before she finally gets all the way. Sorry, my cat. She ends up setting off to go home, but she ends up finding out that she ends up walking into the house and finds Diana and the kid not there. She left. But Ellie's stuff's still in the house. And then at the end, it shows the clip of the last talk that she had with Joel as she's playing Joel's guitar. And then it kind of comes out of it, and then it shows Ellie putting the guitar up against the window. It's basically kind of Ellie making peace with it. And I think she finally ends up forgiving Joel and finally does it to heal herself. And she grabs her backpack as she sets off. I don't know if she sets off to go after Diana. I don't know if she sets off to go back to Tommy's. I don't know exactly what's in store for Ellie. They kind of leave that up to all of us of what happens. I think she does eventually going after Diana, but I don't think they end up going back together. I think Diana ends up staying with Jesse and ends up marrying him. And I think she ends up finding a life for herself. But I also think that it still becomes a bit complicated between the two of them at times, but they find ways to learn to deal with it, and they finally just be friends and, just move on from it. And she becomes part of Diana's kid's life too. And, everything just kind of works itself out. But I also know that Tommy probably ends up divorced from his wife, though, because of everything. But I still think that they still find some way to deal with each other in the same room and still fight for the same things that they want to fight for. And, they just kind of leave it up to us. But that's what I think. But with all of that said, I'm going to kind of give a shorter version of what I think. Now that I've kind of told you the story, it's pretty long. It was a huge controversy with the part with the sexual contact scene between Abby and an old fling of hers, and then a scene with Diana and Ellie, and then the scene where we find out that Ellie likes girls too, or possibly gay. It was a really, really huge kerfuffle with Naughty Dogs over that. People really weren't feeling that very well. They got a really bad negative feedback from it. But in the midst of it, people were divided. There was people on Team Ellie. There was people on Team Abby. It was really kind of funny how that happened. That was the good part that came out of it. People start understanding Abby's point of view. People start seeing Ellie's point of view, because in the game you play as Ellie for a while, and then you also see the perspective on Abby. You get to play Abby and kind of see what she goes through, and kind of see how the horrific event affected her. So it's really cool to see from two different points of view. To see two different sides of the story, and then the truth in the middle. And it was a really good game for me. I'm still not really set on how it went. I was kind of on the offense of some of the emotional stuff on it. So all in all, it's a good game. I highly recommend you guys play them. I highly recommend you go play I highly recommend you guys go try it out for yourself and form your own opinion. It took me a couple of times of seeing The Last of Us Part 2 to finally get what it meant. I had to sit on it for a while. I'm still kind of mixed emotions with Joel's death. I hate that they had to do that. But, it was kind of inevitable with Joel, because he made so many enemies and he did so many things that were bad that it just kind of outweighed all the good that he did. And it kind of changed his life and changed Ellie's life too. And it's just an all-around emotional game. They both were emotional. All three of them were. So you guys should really go check them out. If you guys haven't already, hit that red subscribe button that's underneath this video and the notification bell beside it. So you'll be notified when I upload the next 3 parts of Jessie's Hangout and other episodes and reviews in the future. Also, if you wish to stay more up to date with me, go follow me on all of my social medias. They're listed in the description box below this video. I hope you guys have an awesome evening, day or night or morning, wherever you're watching this from. And I will catch you all in my next episode. Later.